Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last video of Chapter 6. In this video, I'm going to talk about the determinants of bond yields and the term structure of interest rates. As we will see as we proceed on this discussion, that the yield on any particular bond is a reflection of a variety of factors. Okay, some common to all bonds and some specific to the issue under consideration. So look, at any point in time, short-term and long-term interest rates will generally be different. Sometimes short-term interest rates are higher, sometimes long-term interest rates. Okay. Now, what do we mean by short-term and long-term interest rates? Short-term interest rate could be interest rate on a 90-day bank bills. On the other hand, long-term interest rate could be a 10-year government bond yields. So these interest rates are typically different. The relationship between short-term and long-term interest rate is known as the term structure of interest rates. To be a little more precise, the term structure of interest rate tells us what nominal interest rates are on default-free pure discount bonds of all maturities. Okay, I repeat, the term structure of interest rate tells us what nominal interest rates are on default-free pure discount bonds of all maturities. These rates are pure interest rates because they involve no risk of default and a single lump sum future payment. In other words, the term structure tells us the pure time value of money for different lengths of time. Okay. When long-term rates are higher than short-term rates, we say that the term structure is upward sloping. Okay. And when short-term rates are higher, we say it is downward sloping. Okay. I repeat, when long-term rates are higher than short-term rates, we call it upward sloping, upward sloping. And when short-term rates are higher, we say it is downward sloping. Okay. So the term structure can also be harmed. When this occurs, it is usually because rates increase at first and then begin to decline as we look at longer term rates. The most common shape of the term structure is the upward sloping. Okay, but the degree of steepness varies significantly through time. Okay. Now, you may have a question in your mind that what determines the shape of this term structure, that whether it will be an upward sloping or downward sloping. Well, there are three basic components. The first two are the ones we discussed in our previous section, the real rate of interest and rate of inflation. And the third component is interest rate risk. Okay, we also discussed it in one of our previous videos that interest rate risk is the risk that arises from fluctuating interest rates. Okay. The real rate of interest is the compensation investor demand for foregoing the use of their money. Okay. You can think of it as the pure time value of money after adjusting for the effect of inflation. So it is the basic component underlying every interest rate, regardless of the time to maturity. So when the real rate is high, all interest rate will tend to be higher and vice versa. Thus, the real rate does not really determine the shape of the term structure. Instead, it mostly influences the overall interest rates. In contrast, the prospect of future inflation strongly influences the shape of the term structure. Investors thinking about lending money for various lengths of time recognize that future inflation erodes the value of the dollars that will be returned. As a result, investors demand compensation for this loss in the form of higher nominal rate. Okay, that means if expected inflation is higher, they will expect a higher nominal rate, okay, which is known as inflation premium. If investors believe that the rate of inflation will be higher in the future, so long-term interest rate will tend to be higher than the short-term rates. Thus, an upward sloping term structure may be a reflection of anticipated increase in inflation. Similarly, a downward sloping term structure probably reflects the belief that inflation will be falling in the future. The third and last component of the term structure has to do with the interest rate risk. As we discussed earlier, long-term bonds have much greater risk of loss resulting from the changes in interest rates than the shorter-term bonds. Investors recognize this risk and they demand extra compensation in the form of higher rates of bearing. This extra compensation for higher interest rate risk for long-term bonds are called interest rate risk premium. Okay, so the longer the term to maturity, the greater is the interest rate risk. So is the interest rate risk premium. Okay. However, as we discussed earlier, interest rate risk increases at a decreasing rate. So interest rate risk premium also increase at a decreasing rates. Okay. So we can put all these bits and pieces together, and we see that the term structure reflects the combined effect of the real rate of interest, the inflation premium, and the interest rate risk premium. Okay. So look at this diagram where we have a upward sloping term structure. Okay, so in this case, you can see that how the rate of inflation is expected to rise gradually. Okay, so you see that inflation is expected to rise gradually. As a result, inflation premium is also expected to rise. And you also can see that as the time to maturity increases, the interest rate risk increases. As a result, interest rate risk premium also increases, as we discussed a few moments back. And the bottom part is the rate of inflation is expected in the future, but that is the bottom part is the real rate of interest. Okay, and we already have discussed that real rate of interest essentially doesn't have much impact on this term structure. Okay, so you can see that the combined effect of the upward sloping yield curve is contributed by the increasing rate of risk premium, increasing expected inflation premium, and very, very minimally the effect of real rate of return. And a similar explanation comes when it's a downward sloping yield curve or downward sloping term structure. So this is a government bond yield curve, you can see, and also how the different factors affect this yield curve. Yield curve is the graphical representation of term structure of interest rates. Okay. So in this chapter, so far we have discussed bill and bond valuation, interest rate risk, the various features of bills, bonds, bond rating, the impact of inflation, and so on. Okay. Now, let's see how this all affects bond yields. Okay. Now, if you look at this figure, okay, this figure 6.9, you can see that the yield curve is drawn on the government bonds for maturities on issue in 2007 and 2010. Okay. The blue one is the short-term one, so 90-day. This is the 90-day one, okay, and the red one is the 10-year, okay, 10-year government bond yield, okay. And so you can see that the long-term interest rate is upward sloping, and the short-term interest rate yield curve is downward sloping. Okay. So as you probably suspect by now, the shape of the yield curve is a reflection of the term structure of interest rate. In fact, the government bond yield curve and the term structure of interest rate are almost the same thing. Okay. The only difference is that the term structure is based on pure discount bonds, whereas the yield curve is based on coupon bonds. Okay. So as a result, government bond yields depend on the three components that underlie the term structure: the real interest rate, the expected rate of inflation, and interest rate premium, which largely reflect the default risk associated with and the liquidity of particular bond. Okay. Government bonds have three important features that we need to remember: that they are default risk-free, they are taxable, and they are highly liquid. Okay. Not all this is true of bonds in general. So we need to understand what additional factors come into play when we look at bonds issued by corporations. Okay. The first thing to consider is the credit risk. Okay. Credit risk or default risk. Okay. Investors recognize that issuers other than the federal government may or may not make all the promised payments on a bond. So they demand a higher yield as compensation for this risk. And this extra compensation is called default risk premium. Okay. An important thing to recognize about the bond's yield is that it is calculated assuming that all promised payment will be made. Okay. As a result, it is really a promised yield. So it might be different if the promised cash flows are not paid out. Okay. Finally, bonds have varying degrees of liquidity. As we have learned earlier, that there are a large number of bonds issues, most of which do not trade in the market on a regular basis. As a result, if you wanted to sell quickly, you would probably not get as good price as you would be expecting otherwise. Okay, so investors prefer liquid asset to illiquid ones. So they demand a liquidity premium, which means that if a bond is less liquid, they will want a compensation for investing in the less liquid bond, which is called a liquidity premium. Okay, so this liquidity premium will be a premium in addition to the other premium we discussed, for example, default risk premium. Okay. So that's almost the end of this video. So to conclude, if we combine all the things we have discussed so far in this chapter, we find that bond yields represent the combined effect of no fewer than 6 things. Okay, so expected future inflation, interest rate risk, default risk, taxability, lack of liquidity. At least these 5 factors are the most prominent ones. Okay. So that's the end of our discussion in this chapter. So don't hesitate to let me know if you have any problem understanding any of the topics. Okay. So thank you very much.